The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the dusty saloon in Silver Creek, Texas, and Eleanor Hayes stepped down onto the wooden boardwalk with nothing but a worn carpetbag and secrets that burned hotter than the August sun of 1873. She had traveled 300 miles from Louisiana, fleeing a past that had left marks on more than just her memory, and now she stood in this frontier town hoping the distance would be enough to bury what she had endured. The afternoon heat shimmered off the dirt road, and she could smell horses, leather, and the promise of a fresh start that tasted like dust on her tongue. Eleanor was 22 years old. With dark auburn hair she kept pinned beneath a simple bonnet, and eyes the color of creek water after a storm. She wore a high-necked dress despite the heat, long sleeves buttoned to her wrists, and she carried herself with a careful grace that spoke of someone who had learned to move through the world without drawing attention. The war had ended 8 years ago, but its aftermath still rippled through the South like stones thrown into a pond, and Eleanor had been caught in those ripples in ways that made her skin crawl and her heart race with shame she did not deserve to feel. She had answered an advertisement for a seamstress position at the general store, and the owner, a kind-faced woman named Martha Brennan, had written back with an offer of employment and lodging above the shop. Eleanor clutched that letter like a lifeline as she walked down the main street, past the livery stable and the land office, past men in dusty chaps and women with sun-weathered faces who glanced at her with the mild curiosity reserved for newcomers. Silver Creek was a cattle town, swollen with drovers and ranchers, and it hummed with an energy that felt both dangerous and alive. Martha Brennan turned out to be a woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair and hands roughened by years of hard work. She welcomed Eleanor with a warm smile and showed her to the small room above the store that would be her home. The room was simple but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the street. Eleanor set down her carpetbag and felt something in her chest loosen just slightly. This could work. This could be the place where she became someone new. She started work the next morning, and the rhythm of it soothed her. She mended torn shirts and hemmed dresses, sewed curtains for the preacher's wife, and embroidered initials onto handkerchiefs for the banker. Her fingers were nimble and sure, and Martha praised her skill. The days passed in a blur of thread and fabric, and Eleanor began to feel almost safe. Almost. It was on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after her arrival, that Jackson Cole walked into the general store. Eleanor was at the counter, sorting through a shipment of buttons, when she heard the door open and looked up to see him. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscular build of a man who spent his days in the saddle. He wore a dusty brown hat, a faded blue shirt, and a leather vest, and his face was tanned from the sun, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often. Those eyes were a startling shade of blue, bright and clear, and when they met Eleanor's, she felt something shift inside her chest like a door opening. "Afternoon," he said, his voice low and pleasant. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was pure cowboy courtesy. "I am looking for some thread, heavy-duty stuff that can handle mending saddle leather." Eleanor found her voice, though it came out quieter than she intended. "We have some in the back. I'll get it for you." She moved quickly, grateful for the excuse to look away from those blue eyes, and retrieved the spool of thick thread from the storage room. When she returned, he was leaning against the counter, relaxed and easy, and he smiled at her when she handed him the thread. It was a smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners, and Eleanor felt her heart do something foolish and unexpected. "Thank you, miss," he said. "I am Jackson Cole. I work at the Double R Ranch, about 5 miles north of town." "Eleanor Hayes," she replied, and then, because Martha had taught her that friendliness was good for business, she added, "Are you new to the area?" "Been here about 3 years," Jackson said. "Came up from Oklahoma after I finished working a trail drive. Liked the look of the country and decided to stay. How about you? You are new in town, are not you?" "I arrived 2 weeks ago," Eleanor said, "from Louisiana." "Long way to travel," Jackson observed, and there was something in his tone that was curious but not prying. "What brought you to Silver Creek?" Eleanor felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the instinct to deflect and redirect. "Work," she said simply. "I am a seamstress." Jackson nodded, accepting her answer without pushing for more. He paid for the thread and tipped his hat again. "Well, welcome to Silver Creek, Miss Hayes. I hope you will find it suits you." And then he was gone, the door swinging shut behind him, and Eleanor stood there with her heart beating too fast and her hands trembling slightly. She told herself it was nothing, just a simple transaction, but she knew she was lying. There had been something in the way he looked at her, something kind and genuine, and it had cracked open a door she had been trying to keep locked. Over the following weeks, Jackson Cole became a regular visitor to the general store. He always had some small errand that brought him into town, and he always made a point of stopping by the counter where Eleanor worked. He was never forward or inappropriate, but he was friendly in a way that felt effortless, and Eleanor found herself looking forward to his visits. He told her about the ranch, about the cattle drives and the hard work of keeping a spread running, and she told him small, carefully edited pieces of her own story. She mentioned the war, the hardships that followed, the need to start fresh, but she never spoke of the things that had driven her away. Jackson was 25 years old, and he had grown up on a farm in Missouri before the war took his father and older brother. He had spent his teenage years working whatever jobs he could find, drifting from place to place, until he discovered that he had a gift for handling horses and cattle. He was a cowboy in the truest sense of the word, a man who lived by a code of hard work and honesty, and Eleanor found herself drawn to him in ways that both thrilled and terrified her. One evening in late September, as the heat of summer began to give way to the cooler temperatures of autumn, Jackson asked Eleanor if she would take a walk with him. They strolled down the main street as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and Jackson talked about a wild Mustang he had been trying to gentle. Eleanor listened, her hands folded in front of her, and felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the weather. They stopped at the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open prairie, and Jackson turned to face her. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was serious now, "I know you have not been here long, and I do not want to presume anything, but I would like to call on you properly, with your permission." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She had known this was coming, had felt it building between them, but hearing the words out loud made it real in a way that frightened her. "Jackson, she began, and then stopped, not sure how to finish the sentence. "If there is someone else, or if you're not interested, just say so," Jackson said quickly. "I will respect that. But I think there is something between us, and I would like to see where it might lead." Eleanor looked up at him, at the earnestness in his blue eyes, and felt her resolve crumbling. She wanted this. She wanted him. But the secret she carried felt like a wall between them, and she did not know how to climb over it. "There is no one else," she said softly, "and I would like that. But Jackson, there are things about my past that are difficult, things I'm not ready to talk about." "Everyone has a past," Jackson said. He reached out and gently took her hand, his touch warm and solid. "I am not asking you to tell me everything right now. I'm just asking for a chance." Eleanor nodded, her eyes stinging with unexpected tears. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, you can call on me." Their courtship began in earnest after that. Jackson came to town whenever he could spare the time, and they spent their evenings walking together or sitting on the bench outside the general store talking about everything and nothing. Jackson was patient and attentive, never pushing her for more than she was ready to give. And Eleanor felt herself falling for him with a helplessness that was both exhilarating and terrifying. She had never expected to feel this way about anyone, had thought that part of her heart had been burned away by what she had endured, but Jackson made her believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have something good, Winter came to Silver Creek with a vengeance, bringing cold winds and occasional snow that dusted the prairie in white. Jackson gave Eleanor his spare coat, a heavy sheepskin-lined jacket that smelled like leather and horses, and she wore it gratefully as they walked through the quiet streets. He told her he was saving money to buy his own piece of land someday, a small ranch where he could raise horses and build a life, and Eleanor let herself imagine being part of that future. It was a dangerous dream, but she could not help herself. On a cold evening in early December, Jackson invited Eleanor to have dinner at the town's small restaurant. It was a simple place, but the food was good, and they sat by the fire talking and laughing over plates of roasted chicken and potatoes. Eleanor felt relaxed in a way she had not in months, and when Jackson reached across the table to take her hand, she did not pull away. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and serious, "I have been thinking about this for a while now, and I need to say it. I am falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, and Eleanor felt her heart seize in her chest. She had known, of course, had felt the same thing growing inside her, but hearing him say it made it real and terrifying. "Jackson," she whispered, and her voice broke. "You do not have to say it back," Jackson said quickly. "I just wanted you to know. I care about you, Eleanor, more than I have ever cared about anyone, and whatever happened in your past, whatever you are carrying, it does not change how I feel." Eleanor felt the tears spill over, hot tracks down her cold cheeks. She wanted to tell him she loved him too, wanted to let herself fall into this feeling without reservation, but the weight of her secrets felt like a stone around her neck. "There is something I need to tell you," she said, and her voice was barely audible. "Something I should have told you before now." Jackson squeezed her hand. "You can tell me anything." But Eleanor shook her head. "Not here. Not in this public place." "Can we go somewhere private?" she asked. They left the restaurant and walked through the cold night until they reached the small stable behind the general store. Jackson lit a lantern, and the warm glow filled the space, illuminating the hay bales and the single horse that Martha kept for deliveries. Eleanor stood in the center of the stable, her arms wrapped around herself, and tried to find the words. "After the war," she began, her voice shaking, "things were very hard in Louisiana. My family had lost everything. My father died during the fighting, and my mother passed away from fever 2 years later. I was 18 years old and alone, and I had no money and no prospects. I took work where I could find it, but it was never enough." Jackson listened without interrupting, his face grave in the lantern light. "There was a man," Eleanor continued, and the words tasted like ash in her mouth. "A plantation owner named Cyrus Hargrave. He had money and power, and he offered me work as a housekeeper. I thought it was a blessing. I thought I was safe." She paused, her breath coming in short gasps, and Jackson stepped closer, his presence solid and reassuring. "He treated me like property," Eleanor said, and the words came faster now, tumbling out in a rush. "He said I owed him for the food and shelter he provided, that I was bound to him until I could pay off my debt, but the debt never got smaller, it only grew. And when I tried to leave, She stopped, her throat closing around the words. "What did he do?" Jackson asked, and his voice was gentle but edged with something harder. Eleanor turned away from him, her hands shaking as she reached up to the high collar of her dress. Slowly, with fingers that felt numb and clumsy, she began to unbutton the top buttons. She pulled the fabric aside, exposing the pale skin of her shoulder and the edge of her collarbone, and then she turned slightly so Jackson could see. There, burned into her skin just above her left breast, was a brand. It was a simple design, the initials CH intertwined, raised and puckered and unmistakably deliberate. Eleanor heard Jackson's sharp intake of breath, and she closed her eyes against the shame that washed over her. "I was branded by my former owner," she confessed quietly, the words falling into the silence like stones into deep water. "He said it was to make sure I would never forget who I belonged to. He said no one else would ever want me after that. For a long moment there was only silence, and Eleanor felt the tears streaming down her face. She waited for Jackson to recoil, to turn away from her in disgust, to tell her she should have said something sooner. She waited for the rejection she was certain would come, but instead she felt Jackson's hands on her shoulders, gentle and warm. He turned her slowly to face him, and when she opened her eyes she saw that his face was filled not with revulsion, but with a fierce, protective anger and something that looked like heartbreak. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion, "that man did not own you. He had no right to do that to you. You are not property. You are a person, a beautiful, brave, incredible person, and what he did was a crime and a sin." Eleanor sobbed, the sound torn from her chest, and Jackson pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she cried. He stroked her hair and whispered words of comfort, and Eleanor clung to him like he was the only solid thing in a world that was spinning out of control. When her sobs finally subsided, Jackson pulled back slightly, just enough to look down at her. His eyes were bright with unshed tears, and there was a determination in his face that made Eleanor's heart clench. "May I?" he asked softly. And Eleanor did not understand at first, but then he gestured toward her shoulder, where the fabric of her dress still hung open. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and Jackson gently pushed the fabric aside a little more, exposing the brand fully. He looked at it for a long moment, and Eleanor saw the muscle in his jaw tighten. Then slowly, reverently, he bent his head and pressed his lips to the scar. The kiss was tender and lingering, and Eleanor felt something inside her break open, a dam of pain and shame that she had been holding back for so long. Jackson kissed the brand as if he could erase it with his touch, as if he could pour all the love and acceptance she had been denied into that one gesture. And when he lifted his head, he looked into her eyes and whispered, "I love you, Eleanor Hayes, not despite this, not in spite of what was done to you, but because of who you are. You are the strongest, most courageous woman I have ever met, and I would be honored if you would let me love you for the rest of my life." Eleanor's breath came out in a shuddering gasp, and she reached up to cup his face in her hands. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have loved you for weeks, but I was so afraid that if you knew, you would not want me anymore." "I will always want you," Jackson said fiercely, "always. And if Cyrus Hargrave ever comes near you again, he will have to answer to me." They stood there in the warm glow of the lantern, holding each other, and Eleanor felt something she had not felt in years. Hope. Real, tangible hope. That she could have a future that was not defined by her past. That she could be loved and cherished and safe. The next few months were a whirlwind of emotion and planning. Jackson was true to his word, and he courted Eleanor with a devotion that made her heart swell. He introduced her to his friends at the ranch, and they welcomed her warmly. Martha Brennan, who had suspected there was something between Eleanor and Jackson, gave her blessing with a knowing smile. And Eleanor, for the first time in her life, felt like she was part of a community, like she belonged. In February of 1874, Jackson asked Eleanor to marry him. He did it simply, without fanfare, on a cold evening as they walked through the snowy streets of Silver Creek. He stopped in front of the church and took both her hands in his. "Eleanor Hayes," he said, "I know we have not known each other long, but I know my own heart, and I know that I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Eleanor did not hesitate. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married in the spring, on a warm April day when the prairie was covered in wildflowers. The ceremony was small, held in the little church with Martha Brennan and a few friends from the ranch in attendance. Eleanor wore a simple white dress that she had sewn herself, and Jackson wore his best suit, his hair slicked back and his eyes shining with joy. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Jackson kissed her with a tenderness that made Eleanor's heart overflow, and she knew that she had finally found the home she had been searching for. They moved into a small house on the edge of town that Jackson had been renting, and Eleanor set about making it a home. She hung curtains in the windows and planted a garden in the yard, and Jackson built her a sewing room where she could continue her work. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm, and Eleanor found herself happier than she had ever been. But the past has a way of catching up, and in late summer of that year, Eleanor's worst fear came to fruition. She was working in the general store one afternoon when a stranger walked in, a tall man with cold eyes and an air of entitlement that made her blood run cold. She did not recognize him at first, but when he spoke, asking about a woman named Eleanor Hayes, she felt her heart stop. "I am looking for a woman who used to work for a Mr. Cyrus Hargrave in Louisiana," the man said to Martha. "She disappeared last year, and Mr. Hargrave is very interested in finding her." Eleanor felt the room spin around her, and she gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. Martha, bless her, looked at the man with cool disdain. "I do not know anyone by that name," she said, "and even if I did, I would not tell you." The man's eyes narrowed, and he looked around the store. His gaze landed on Eleanor, and she saw recognition flicker across his face. "You," he said, stepping toward her. "You are her, are not you? You are Eleanor Hayes." Eleanor felt panic rising in her throat, but before she could respond, the door to the store burst open and Jackson strode in. He must have been passing by and seen the stranger through the window because his face was set in hard lines and his hand rested on the gun at his hip. "Is there a problem here?" Jackson asked, his voice low and dangerous. The stranger looked at Jackson and seemed to reassess the situation. "I am here on behalf of Mr. Cyrus Hargrave," he said. "This woman owes him a debt, and he wants her returned to Louisiana." "My wife does not owe anyone anything," Jackson said, and there was steel in his voice, "and she is not going anywhere." "Your wife?" The stranger's lip curled. "Did she tell you what she is? Did she tell you that she is marked property?" Jackson moved so fast that Eleanor barely saw it. One moment he was standing by the door, and the next he had the stranger by the collar, slamming him back against the wall. "My wife is not property," Jackson said, his voice shaking with fury. "She is a free woman, and what Cyrus Hargrave did to her was illegal and immoral. Now you are going to get out of this town, and you are going to tell Hargrave that if he ever sends anyone after Eleanor again, I will hunt him down myself and make him answer for what he did." The stranger struggled, but Jackson's grip was iron. "She is branded," the man spat. "She belongs to him." "She belongs to no one but herself," Jackson said, "and she chose to be my wife. Now get out before I lose my temper." He released the stranger, who stumbled toward the door, straightening his coat and glaring at Jackson. "Hargrave will not let this go," he said. "Let him try," Jackson replied. "I have friends in this town, and we look after our own." The stranger left, and Jackson turned to Eleanor, who was shaking uncontrollably. He gathered her into his arms, holding her tightly, and she buried her face in his chest. "He found me," she whispered. "He found me." "And we sent him packing," Jackson said firmly. "Eleanor, listen to me. Hargrave has no legal claim on you. What he did was slavery, and that has been illegal since the war ended. If he tries to come after you, we will fight him. The law is on our side, and so is everyone in this town." Eleanor wanted to believe him, but the fear was still there, coiled tight in her chest. That evening, Jackson called a meeting at the town hall, and what Eleanor saw there took her breath away. The ranchers and shopkeepers, the cowboys and farmers, they all came. Martha Brennan spoke first, telling them about the stranger and what he had demanded, and then Jackson stood up and told them Eleanor's story, with her permission, not sparing the details of what Hargrave had done. There was a moment of shocked silence, and then the town erupted in outrage. The sheriff, a grizzled man named Tom Brennan, who was Martha's husband, stood up and declared that Eleanor was under the protection of Silver Creek, and anyone who tried to take her would have to go through all of them. The men vowed to keep watch to make sure no more of Hargrave's agents came looking, and the women gathered around Eleanor, offering support and solidarity. Eleanor cried that night, but they were tears of relief and gratitude. She had spent so long feeling alone and ashamed, and now she was surrounded by people who cared about her, who were willing to stand up for her. Jackson held her as she cried, and he whispered promises of safety and love until she finally fell asleep. In the weeks that followed, there was no more sign of Hargrave or his agents. The town remained vigilant, but as the months passed and nothing happened, Eleanor began to relax. She threw herself into her work and her marriage, and she found joy in the simple rhythms of daily life. Jackson was everything she could have hoped for in a husband. Kind, patient, and deeply loving. He never made her feel less than whole, and he treated the scar on her shoulder with such tenderness that Eleanor gradually stopped seeing it as a mark of shame and began to see it as a testament to her survival. In the spring of 1875, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a mixture of joy and terror, and Jackson was ecstatic. He was attentive and protective, making sure she did not overwork herself and fetching the doctor at the slightest concern. Eleanor bloomed under his care, and as her belly grew, she felt a sense of wonder that she was creating a new life, a life that would be born into love and freedom. Their son was born in November of that year, a healthy baby with a shock of dark hair and his father's blue eyes. They named him Samuel, after Jackson's father, and Eleanor fell in love with him the moment she held him in her arms. Jackson was a devoted father, taking to the role with the same commitment he brought to everything else. He would sit for hours with Samuel in his arms, talking to him softly and singing old songs his own father had taught him. Life in Silver Creek continued to flourish. Jackson had saved enough money to buy a small piece of land just outside of town, and he began building a ranch house with his own hands. Eleanor helped where she could, and by the time Samuel was 2 years old, they moved into their new home. It was a modest place, but it was theirs, and Eleanor loved every inch of it. She planted flowers around the porch and hung lace curtains in the windows, and Jackson built a corral for the horses he was beginning to breed. In 1877, Eleanor gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Rose. She had Eleanor's auburn hair and a smile that could light up a room, and Samuel was instantly smitten with his baby sister. The ranch continued to grow, and Jackson's reputation as a skilled horseman brought in steady business. Eleanor continued her sewing work, taking on commissions from women all over the county, and together they built a life that was rich in love, if not in wealth. The years passed in a blur of hard work and happiness. Samuel grew into a strong, curious boy who followed his father everywhere, learning to ride and rope and care for the animals. Rose was a bright, spirited child who loved to help her mother in the garden and insisted on learning to sew as soon as her fingers were big enough to hold a needle. Eleanor watched her children grow and felt a gratitude so profound it brought tears to her eyes. This was the life she had dreamed of, the life she had thought was impossible. In 1880, when Samuel was 5 and Rose was 3, Eleanor and Jackson sat on the porch of their ranch house one evening, watching the sun set over the prairie. Samuel was playing in the yard with a wooden horse Jackson had carved for him, and Rose was asleep inside, worn out from a day of chasing butterflies. Jackson reached over and took Eleanor's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if we had not met?" he asked. Eleanor considered the question. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not in a sad way. More like I am grateful for every twist of fate that brought me here." "I am grateful too," Jackson said. "I cannot imagine my life without you, Eleanor. You and the children, you are everything to me." Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him. "I love you, Jackson Cole," she said, "more than I ever thought it was possible to love someone." "I love you too," Jackson replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, "and I will keep loving you until the day I die." In 1882, Eleanor gave birth to their third child, another son they named Thomas. He was a quiet, thoughtful baby, and Eleanor joked that he must have inherited her cautious nature. Jackson laughed and said that was just fine. They could use a little balance in the household. Samuel and Rose doted on their baby brother, and the house was filled with the noise and chaos of a growing family. As the years went on, the ranch prospered. Jackson's horses were in high demand, and Eleanor's sewing business brought in additional income. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. The children grew healthy and strong, and Eleanor marveled at the life they had built together. The scar on her shoulder faded over time, the raised tissue softening and blending more with her skin, but even when it was barely visible, Jackson never stopped kissing it, never stopped reminding her that she was loved and cherished. It became a ritual between them, a silent affirmation of everything they had overcome and everything they had built together. In 1885, when Samuel was 10, Rose was 8, and Thomas was 3, the family took a trip into town for the annual Harvest Festival. It was a joyous occasion with music and dancing and food, and the children ran wild with their friends. Eleanor and Jackson stood together watching their children play, and Jackson put his arm around her waist. "We did good," he said, and there was pride in his voice. "We did," Eleanor agreed. "We did very good." That night, after the children were asleep, Eleanor and Jackson lay in bed together, the moonlight streaming through the window. Eleanor traced the lines of Jackson's face with her fingertips, memorizing every detail. "Do you remember the night I told you about the brand?" she asked softly. "I will never forget it," Jackson said. "It was the night I realized how strong you are, how much you had survived, and it was the night I knew I would do anything to make you happy." "You have made me happy," Eleanor said, "happier than I ever thought I could be." Jackson pulled her close, kissing her deeply, and Eleanor melted into him. Their love had only grown stronger over the years, deepened by shared struggles and triumphs, and Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that she had found her home. The years continued to roll by, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their children's lives. Samuel grew into a young man who shared his father's love of horses and his mother's quiet strength. Rose became a talented seamstress in her own right, with a gift for design that surpassed even Eleanor's skill. Thomas, true to his early nature, became a voracious reader and dreamed of becoming a teacher. In 1890, when Eleanor was 39 years old and Jackson was 42, they celebrated their 16th wedding anniversary. The children threw them a party, inviting friends and neighbors from all over the county, and the ranch house overflowed with laughter and love. Martha Brennan, now in her 70s but still sharp as a tack, gave a toast that brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. "I remember the day Eleanor Hayes walked into my store," Martha said, raising her glass. "She was scared and alone, carrying secrets that would have broken a lesser woman. But she was also brave and determined, and she had the good sense to fall in love with Jackson Cole, one of the finest men I have ever known. Watching them build a life together, watching their family grow, has been one of the great joys of my life. To Eleanor and Jackson, may you have many more years of happiness in us." Everyone cheered, and Eleanor looked at Jackson through a blur of tears. He smiled at her, that same warm, genuine smile that had captured her heart all those years ago, and she knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. In 1895, Samuel married a young woman named Catherine, the daughter of a neighboring rancher, and they built a house on the far edge of the Cole property. Eleanor watched her firstborn son start his own family and felt a bittersweet mixture of pride and nostalgia. Rose was courting a young carpenter from town, and Thomas had been accepted to a teaching college in Austin. The children were growing up, building their own lives, and Eleanor and Jackson were entering a new phase of their journey together. On a warm evening in June of 1896, Eleanor and Jackson sat on the porch of their ranch house, much as they had done countless times before. They were older now, their hair streaked with gray, and their faces lined with the passage of time, but the love between them burned as brightly as ever. Eleanor's hand rested in Jackson's, and she looked out over the land they had built their life on, the place where she had finally found peace. "Do you ever regret it?" Jackson asked suddenly. "Marrying a poor cowboy instead of someone who could have given you an easier life?" Eleanor turned to look at him, surprised by the question. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. You gave me the greatest gift anyone could give me, Jackson. You gave me love. You gave me a family. You gave me a life worth living. I would not change a single thing." Jackson's eyes were bright with emotion, and he raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Eleanor Cole," he said. "I mean that with everything I am." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Samuel's children, their grandchildren, were playing in the yard, their laughter ringing out clear and bright. Rose and her fiancé were visiting for the weekend, and Thomas would be home from college in a few days. The house that had once held just the two of them now overflowed with life and love, and Eleanor felt a contentment so deep it was almost overwhelming. In the years that followed, Eleanor and Jackson became the heart of their growing family. They welcomed more grandchildren, taught them to ride and sow and love the land, and passed on the stories of their own journey. Eleanor never hid the brand on her shoulder from her grandchildren. When they were old enough to understand, she told them the truth about where she had come from and what she had survived. She wanted them to know that strength came from facing hardship, that love could heal even the deepest wounds, and that family was not just about blood, but about the people who chose to stand by you. In 1900, as the new century dawned, Eleanor and Jackson celebrated their 26th wedding anniversary surrounded by their children and grandchildren. It was a grand affair with food and music and dancing, and Eleanor felt her heart overflow with joy. She looked at Jackson across the crowded room, and he winked at her, that same playful, loving gesture that had always made her heart skip a beat. That night, as they prepared for bed, Jackson helped Eleanor unbutton the back of her dress, his fingers gentle and familiar. The brand on her shoulder was barely visible now, just a faint shadow on her skin, but Jackson still kissed it, just as he had done on that fateful night in the stable so many years ago. "I love you," he whispered against her skin. "My brave, beautiful Eleanor." "I love you too," Eleanor replied, turning to face him. "My wonderful, steadfast Jackson." They climbed into bed together, and Jackson pulled her close, her back against his chest, his arm wrapped around her waist. Eleanor closed her eyes and listened to the sound of his breathing, the steady rhythm that had lulled her to sleep for more than 2 decades. She thought about the girl she had been when she arrived in Silver Creek, scared and scarred, and convinced she was unlovable. And she thought about the woman she had become, a wife and mother and grandmother, surrounded by love and proof that the past did not have to define the future. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. There were hard times, droughts that tested the ranch, and illnesses that frightened the family, but through it all, Eleanor and Jackson stood together, their love a constant source of strength. They grew old together, their bodies slowing, but their spirits still vibrant, and they never stopped holding hands, never stopped stealing kisses when they thought no one was looking. In the spring of 1908, when Eleanor was 57 and Jackson was 60, they took a trip back to Louisiana. It was something Eleanor had thought about for years, a pilgrimage to the place where her story had begun. Jackson held her hand as they traveled, and when they arrived at the town where she had grown up, Eleanor felt a strange mixture of emotions. So much had changed, and yet some things remained the same. They visited her parents' graves, and Eleanor placed wildflowers on the simple headstones. She told Jackson stories about her childhood, about the mother who had taught her to sew and the father who had loved books. And then, with Jackson at her side, she went to see the plantation where Cyrus Hargrave had kept her. The place was abandoned, the grand house falling into disrepair, the fields overgrown with weeds. Eleanor stood at the gate looking at the ruins and felt nothing but a distant sort of pity. Hargrave was long dead, she had learned, his fortune lost in bad investments and his name forgotten. The place that had haunted her nightmares for so long was just a broken-down relic, powerless and empty. "It is over," Eleanor said softly. "It is really over." Jackson squeezed her hand. "It has been over for a long time, love, but I'm glad you can see that now." They returned to Texas with lighter hearts, and Eleanor felt as though a final burden had been lifted from her shoulders. She threw herself into her life with renewed energy, cherishing every moment with her family, every sunrise over the prairie, every quiet evening with Jackson on the porch. In 1912, Samuel gave them their 10th grandchild, and Eleanor held the tiny baby in her arms and marveled at the miracle of it. This child, this perfect little life, was part of her legacy, proof that love could triumph over hate, that healing was possible, and that the future could be brighter than the past. As Eleanor and Jackson moved into their 60s and then their 70s, they became beloved figures in Silver Creek. They were the couple everyone pointed to as an example of true love, the pair who had weathered every storm and come out stronger. Young couples sought their advice, and children loved to hear their stories. On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1914, the entire town turned out to celebrate. There was a parade down the main street, and the mayor gave a speech honoring their contributions to the community. Eleanor and Jackson stood together holding hands, and Eleanor looked out at the sea of faces at the town that had become her home, and felt a gratitude so profound it brought tears to her eyes. That evening, after the celebrations had wound down and the guests had gone home, Eleanor and Jackson sat on the porch of their ranch house watching the stars come out. The house was quiet now, the children and grandchildren having returned to their own homes, and it was just the two of them again, the way it had been in the beginning. 40 years, Jackson said, shaking his head in wonder. "It feels like both a lifetime and no time at all." "I know what you mean," Eleanor said. "Sometimes I can still see the girl I was when I arrived here, so scared and broken. And then I look at our life, at everything we have built, and I can hardly believe it is real." "It is real," Jackson said, bringing her hand to his lips. "Every moment, every joy, every struggle, it is all real, and it is all ours." Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the night. She thought about the brand on her shoulder, the mark that had once filled her with shame, and now served as a reminder of how far she had come. She thought about Jackson's lips on that scar, the whispered words of love that had healed her in ways she had not known were possible. And she thought about the life they had built together, a life filled with love and laughter and the kind of happiness she had once thought was only for other people. In the years that followed, Eleanor and Jackson continued to age gracefully, their love a beacon for everyone who knew them. They celebrated more anniversaries, welcomed more grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, and they never stopped holding hands, never stopped finding joy in the simple act of being together. In the summer of 1920, when Eleanor was 69 and Jackson was 72, they took one final trip out to the prairie, riding on horseback just as they had done in their younger days. They rode to a spot overlooking the valley, a place where wildflowers grew in profusion and the sky seemed to stretch on forever. They dismounted and sat on a blanket, watching the sun set in a blaze of color. "This is perfect," Eleanor said softly. "I cannot imagine a more beautiful place." "I want to be buried here," Jackson said suddenly, and Eleanor turned to look at him in surprise. "I mean it, Eleanor. When my time comes, I want to be laid to rest here, on this land we love. And I want you beside me when your time comes too." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but she nodded. "Yes," she said, "I would like that. We will be together, always." Jackson kissed her then, a deep, lingering kiss that tasted of salt and love and a lifetime of memories. And as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to appear, Eleanor felt a peace settle over her that was complete and unshakable. They lived several more years, each day a gift they cherished. Jackson passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1925 at the age of 77. Eleanor was devastated by his loss, but she took comfort in the knowledge that he had lived a full, happy life surrounded by the people he loved. They buried him on that spot overlooking the valley, just as he had requested, and Eleanor visited his grave every day, talking to him as if he were still there. Eleanor lived for another 5 years, long enough to see her great-grandchildren grow, and to know that the legacy she and Jackson had built would continue for generations. She passed away quietly in her sleep in the autumn of 1930, at the age of 79, and they laid her to rest beside Jackson on the hill overlooking the valley. The family erected a simple headstone that read, "Eleanor and Jackson Cole, beloved forever together." And indeed they were. Their love story became a legend in Silver Creek, passed down through the generations as a testament to the power of love, the possibility of healing, and the truth that the past does not have to define the future. The ranch they had built continued to thrive under the care of their children and grandchildren, and the little house they had filled with love became a gathering place for the family, a reminder of where they had come from and the values that had sustained them. Years later, when their great-great-grandchildren played in the fields and rode horses across the prairie, they would sometimes pause at the graves on the hill and wonder about the people buried there. And someone would always tell them the story of Eleanor, who had arrived in Silver Creek with nothing but scars and secrets, and Jackson, who had loved her so completely that he had kissed away her pain and whispered love into the wounded places of her heart. It was a story of the Wild West, of hardship and hope, of courage and redemption. But most of all, it was a love story, pure and true, that had endured beyond death and would continue to inspire for generations to come. The brand that had once marked Eleanor as property became, in the end, a symbol of her strength, a reminder that even the deepest wounds could heal when met with love, and that true freedom came not from the absence of scars, but from the presence of someone who saw past them to the beautiful soul beneath. And so the story lived on, a beacon of hope in a hard world, proof that love could conquer even the darkest of pasts, and that happily ever after was not just a fairy tale, but a reality that could be built one day at a time by two people who chose each other against all odds and never let go.